The world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. Hello and welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Today we welcome the visionary Balazs Nemethi to the podcast. Balazs is the founder of Taqanu, a bank for all. Taqanu wants to provide banking to anyone, regardless of background or available documents. One of their first target user groups is refugees displaced by unrest in Syria. But the potential for a solution like Taqanu's extends across refugees, migrants, the financially excluded, and beyond, to any user group seeking a digital solution to identity and financial services. Combining digital identity, blockchain, and a geography-agnostic mobile-only interface, Taqanu seeks to revolutionize financial access for the unbanked. Based in Berlin and supported by some of the most recognizable global change organizations, Taqanu is innovating in an area that could create real improvement in millions of people's lives. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Tweet at us at Rebank Podcast or at me, your host, at Will_Beeson. We recently incorporated a new discussion platform into our website at bankingthefuture.com to support our community and created an exclusive mailing list for insider access to the show. Check out our website to sign up. Please enjoy today's show with Balazs Nemethi. Balazs, welcome to Rebank.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
It's my pleasure. Really great to connect. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So tell us a bit about Taqanu.
All right. So let's start with the name, because it's not just one of those random startup names. It's actually coming from the language Akkadian that was spoken by Hammurabi in 1800 BC in Babylon. And we chose this name because it's one of the oldest languages, and it's the language that was used during the time when the first code of conduct was written by Hammurabi, which contains eye for eye and ear for ear. And Taqanu means to be safe in this language. And on what it is actually, it's basically a financial intermediary that aims to bank the unbanked, and also to give them an identity that they can use and live by.
And how would you describe the problem you're trying to solve?
So the problem is that our today's financial ecosystem is very great for those who are actually able to access the system, but there is a very high number of people who are not qualified to actually access this financial ecosystem. And what we are trying to solve actually is to provide access for anyone, regardless of their background or their residency. Of course, as a startup, yes, for everyone globally, but we will start with a focus, and then slowly we will roll out on a global scheme. We want to focus on our first target group here in Germany, which will be helping the refugees to actually access banking. And then, later on rolling out in the EU with passporting, and then further moving on to reach other regions.
And you guys are based in Berlin, correct?
Yes, indeed. It's actually a reason we moved here, because we want to start with the epicenter of the current refugee crisis. The media calls it refugee crisis, since we want to help the German refugees as our initial target group to be able to access banking in a very fashionable and easy way.
I understand that last year there was a regulatory change in Germany to support the entry of refugees into the existing financial system. What implications does that have for the work you're trying to do?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we are focusing here in Germany, and it's very much supporting our goals, because the regulators already saw the need for providing financial access for the newcomers. And basically this regulation says that everyone who has a right to stay in Germany has a right to have a basic account. But opening this account here in Germany is not as easy as anywhere with a digital first bank. So here within this first initial target group, we will focus on making the onboarding process as smooth as possible and basically prove our concept on how to onboard people, those who do not have these papers or the right to stay in Germany. And once we figure this out, then we will roll forward in the EU.
And how far along is Taqanu now?
I would start with regulations, because I believe that that's the most important part that Taqanu has to solve. And we are in a working group with BaFin, the German Financial Authority, and to actually support our goals, we work together with Deloitte Legal, who help us to actually assess the compliance regulatory questions that come up on the road. And it's very positive reactions that we are receiving from the regulators, and not only because it's a very interesting project, but also because every German citizen actually met with refugees during last year. So there is also like a personal take for them in deciding if our solution can be approved.
Tell us a bit more about some of your early successes. You've had some great support from some very relevant international bodies.
Yes, so that was very important from the beginning, to actually gain credibility as a startup and not just develop something that could be used in a way as it should be, because we will have to work with regulators. We will have to convince them to use a technology that is not yet used for Know Your Customer. So we started to build an advisory board that can help us to answer the questions that regulators ask. As I mentioned before, we work together with Deloitte in Frankfurt so that they can help us on regulations. One of our advisors, Kim Cameron, he is the head of identity at Microsoft, who help us understanding more of the identity questions around the project. We also have advisors from the Rebank, Mia Harbitz, she's the global identity expert at the Rebank. We have an advisor from the Qatar Holding Authority, Abdullah Kuvari, who is helping us on finding the right balance in banking and how it can be done in this fintech world. And I could list some more names, but I think that these are the biggest companies that are surrounding Taqanu to actually reach its goal.
And I suppose it makes perfect sense that you're working with identity experts, because presumably the biggest challenge here is not a banking challenge. It's an identification, authentication, and onboarding challenge, to begin with at least.
Yes. Many cases we consider ourselves more of an identity company with a small angle on fintech rather than a fintech company that also does some identification. And because of that, we put most of our development effort into building the identification system and, as you said, the authentication system in an application that will enable us to do fintech. But, well, in the current fintech world today, there is a lot of plug-and-play solution to build a financial intermediary. So we don't see it as a main problem. It's all around identity.
And that's hugely powerful for this specific user group that you're looking to support, because I would imagine that lack of identity or verifiable identity not only prevents access to banking, but also to a number of other elements of typical day-to-day life. And that by getting an identity through Taqanu, they could potentially leverage that identity in other parts of their lives.
Yes. So identity is a very big topic. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN or the World Bank's ID4D project, which aims to give identity for everyone by 2030, we can see that globally this issue of being identified has been accelerated due to technological advances and the widespread of smartphones. So this definitely can be a core for all these people who we want to serve, that they will have an identity that can be enriched by different providers. And this is why the entire identity management system is built on an open source basis, so that we can allow everyone else to access and enrich these identities.
And what's the strategy? What's the thinking at this point in terms of developing that kind of onboarding process, that all-important onboarding process? How do you expect that to work?
Currently now we are in a collaboration with Microsoft developing this open source identification platform. And basically we are going to be a mobile only solution where one application will be both the identification and the identity management and both a simple banking solution. And in terms of how it's going to work, like basically a customer will build its own identity. Initially, the customer will fill out a form very similar to a social media and start to add different attestations to it that will basically validate its own identity. So we can say that we try to outsource the governmental identification into the hands of people, because the main issue that many people are not identified is related to the lack of support they receive or they don't receive actually from their government.
I suppose that makes great sense. So it's not actually Taqanu vouching for the identity of a particular user. It's Taqanu providing a wallet into which users can contribute elements that construct in their entirety an identity, which they can then use to access areas of not only financial services, but also other parts of their lives. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, very much. So basically, what we are saying in the company is that we don't want to know who you are. We just want to make sure at all times that you are still you. So we constantly authenticate your data that you provided, and we try to verify as much as possible based on attestations that you also provided into your identity. But we are actually not that interested that who you are. So the entire system is built in a way that it's very much scalable and very much independent of the users.
It would sound like an interesting potential use case for some cryptographic techniques that effectively enable visibility on one side, zero knowledge proofs effectively. Is cryptography blockchain related backend anything that you're exploring?
Yes, you have a very good eye for that. So we are actually using blockchain technology for the identity management. And we are not using it because it's the current buzzword in the entire industry, but because we started to research on what would enable us to create the easiest solution for a self-sovereign system. And blockchain seems to be the solution that can enable us to create a solution where all this data, which combined in the identity, is actually owned by the customer. And blockchain can enable us to make such a system with cryptography and private keys that at all times, all data is owned by the customer.
So effectively, there's a blockchain data management component. There's a front-end onboarding component. And then there's a banking component.
Yes. And the banking component is more like an e-money license where we can use or leverage the banking component of an existing banking solution that has all the rights to act as a bank. Mm-hmm. And it also provides us with the flexibility of potentially use multiple backend solutions depending on different regions where different bank licenses are required to act as a player. So we can act between banks and affiliates as like an intermediary platform.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes perfect sense for a model like yours, which is kind of aimed at international scale, because trying to get a banking license, serve as a quote-unquote brick-and-mortar bank in each jurisdiction is no doubt prohibitive. But serving as effectively a front end that leverages existing banking license holders in various countries would allow one to scale much more quickly, and it sounds like address the core problem that you guys are seeking to, which is broad-based financial inclusion.
Yes. So as you said, like once we can actually get an approval from a regulatory framework on using our technology for identifying people, we only will be needed to find local banking partners who can provide us their license and work together them to actually address the market. But because of that, we also don't really need to become experts on the market, because our focus is very much on onboarding people and providing them an identity and access to finance. But we are not going to build a huge liquidity and become like an actual credit company for two reasons. Because it would slow us down to learn the market, and also it would require a very high amount of liquidity and fundraising. So we can basically use the existing providers and provide them a platform where they can access an identified and credit scored customer base. Let's say if we look at an example in Pakistan, for example, then there is a very high number of unbanked people, but the number of cell phones are increasingly growing among citizens. So we can actually help the local microfinance providers to find new customers and also to provide them a much more personalized loan system.
You mentioned once you get regulatory approval for your identification platform. Can you expand on that a little bit? What sort of regulatory approval or go-ahead would you need for an identity service?
So it's not just an identity service, but it's basically an onboarding process. So we are working on KYC regulations, know your customer. And the approval basically would enable us to use only technology-based solution to identify someone and not necessarily use a government ID. Mm-hmm. To add here is very important that this sort of onboarding would onboard the customer into limited banking solution. And this is where the Taqanu idea comes in, because know your customer comes hand in hand with anti-money laundering. And since we are basically lowering the boundaries to access banking, we try to raise the boundaries on anti-money laundering by implementing limits into the system. And these limits are in correlation with the verifiable data in the identity. So basically, the more information we have, the higher the limits can go. And in that sense, in the beginning, we can act as something like a prepaid card provider where information about the customer is very, very low and also limits. But with time and with more information, we can have access and be able to authenticate and verify. We can start raising the limits so customers can have a better experience and a broader experience and actually access banking, even without having the government ID.
That makes perfect sense. And then I guess the transportability of their Taqanu ID to third-party service providers ends up being a function of the risk tolerance of those third-party service providers? Because as you say, they wouldn't have government-issued IDs per se.
Yes, indeed. So we will, like their trustworthiness, which will come in a form of a score, will be belong to also to the customer, which can be used by other third parties. So they can set limits that may be higher than 0, but not as high as owning actually a government ID, that they can provide them with a phone or different services, or maybe even, since we are aiming to actually develop the identity in correlation with the IDA standard, the European Identity Standard, maybe later governments will be supporting this identification technology as well.
I totally get the concept. This is, it would seem to me, a highly rational way of addressing a fundamental problem in various countries at the moment. This, how do you create an electronic ID that's transportable, that can be used to encourage financial inclusion when there isn't necessarily a government-led framework in place to drive that? I think this is hugely powerful.
Yeah, and then actually you would be surprised that I think now initially we're thinking countries that are in the third world, but recently there was a MasterCard research just surfaced that stated that within the EU there is roughly 130 million people not accessing the financial ecosystem. It has various reasons, and one is definitely the cost of accessing it, and the other is the availability.
In terms of the banking component of the platform, you mentioned effectively working off of licensed banks in various countries. Thinking about Germany specifically, which products do you expect to offer from launch, and what sort of relationship would you expect to have in place to do that? Is it a prepaid card and transaction account model like some of the neobanks we've seen in the UK and Europe and US, I suppose, or is it different than that?
In terms, we will offer a very basic entry banking level solution, but with a normal debit card, with the previously mentioned limits. The big difference is that with the normal debit card, we actually can attract not only disenfranchised people, but basically anyone to use this solution as a primary. And then later, with the limits, with the raise of the limits, initially they can turn into normal bank accounts. But there has to be the same opportunities in the hands of refugees, new migrants, homeless people, as well as just normal citizens.
It would seem that the underlying bank license holder would be responsible for taking on some level of KYC and AML risk in this arrangement. Is that your expectation? And have you found a bank or multiple banks that would be willing to support you guys?
This is where I believe that we will start to differentiate from most of the UK and main Europe challenger banks, because we are aiming initially for an e-money license. And with the e-money license, we will have the opportunity to onboard clients. And with the onboarding, we basically take the risk of what comes with the clients. So our goal is to de-risk our partner bank from managing the money of the above mentioned client group, and we can take the anti-money laundering and other risks that could come with them.
You alluded previously to one potential source of revenue, which was basically identifying credit scoring users of third-party products. I think you mentioned loans potentially for third-party loan providers. Is that your intended route to revenue, or are there other components as well?
Yes, so basically we want to focus on customer onboarding and just providing the access and making the system as open for third parties as possible. So more to create like this, a revenue sharing model. However, with time, there is one opportunity that we want to embrace, and this is remittance. Since we will have a large number of identified group who we can trust because we know their background, we can enable them to transfer money directly from one account to another one, avoiding corner remittance services.
How far down the road do you think revenue generation and eventually profitability are for you guys? How much of the aim is driving social good, and how much of the aim is creating a financially viable long-term business?
I think the two comes hand in hand to a long-term financially viable business and social good, while social good is definitely the most important one. And it also reflects our fundraising strategy, why currently we are much more aiming for impact investors and philanthropists to be able to fund our development costs. And also we want to move along these lines to actually not become a return on investment oriented company, but focus on our clients' good and their opportunities, and basically just leverage the knowledge that we build together with our clients to let them access other financial services or generally just other services through their identity.
How have you funded Taqanu so far, and what are your plans going forward?
So far, Taqanu has been self-funded. So we are bootstrapping the company because we didn't know how the regulatory burden we could overcome with time. And now, as we see that it's moving along our expectations, we actually started a fundraising round where we seek philanthropists and impact investors, and basically people who believe what we are doing has a much bigger social impact than just building a fintech company.
You mentioned you're currently in the middle of a fundraising round. What's the expected time frame for that?
Yeah, so we are expecting to be able to close our round within the next 2 months, so that we can have the initial necessities, what we need to cover our development costs. And then potentially we will have a much bigger round in the early summer month.
How is Taqanu being built? We talked to an extent about some of the component parts. Is your development predominantly in-house or outsourced?
It's being built with the notion of security first, because that's what all identity about, and it should be. And mainly for now, we are focusing on identity, and that's being designed in-house, as well as the core identity management platform is in collaboration with Microsoft. Why the financial components would very likely will be from other providers who already experted different elements of the technology. There is one element what's very important for us, and that's scalability. So we are aiming to build a system where there is no human interaction is needed to actually manage all the points that need to onboard people and then provide them to access finance, and then to, in Europe, to receive a bank card, and to be able to avoid human interaction.
I believe you mentioned to me in prior conversation that supporting governments, in this case, perhaps the German government, in delivering support payments to refugees could be an interesting opportunity for Taqanu. Currently, I imagine it's exceedingly difficult for government support to arrive to those that need to receive it when they don't have bank accounts.
Yes, like this is where we actually started to build our revenue stream, and then we figured that these refugees in Germany already have some form of access to finance already. But then as we were moving towards in our research back in the day, we learned that not only the German government, but basically every organization that provide any form of support for the disenfranchised have the problem of cash management. We are talking about NGOs providing food or as well money for disenfranchised people, or government sending disbursement money to the people who arrived or in their country and below the poverty line. So there is a lot of problems in actually sending funds to the disenfranchised because of their lack of identity and their lack of access to finance. So with our system, we could be able to support that. And just to add here to the previous question as well, while we won't have much human interaction with our clients, our customer service will be not a bot system, but refugees will support and help their peers to actually understand what we are doing. So we intend to actually hire newcomers to support their peers to understand the entire system.
That's interesting. So you're actually creating jobs amongst these disenfranchised groups as well.
Yes, like many people ask that, why you are not building bots? And yes, it's a normal question if your bank entirely works on English or a big language. But we are talking about multiple languages, and we want to support everyone in as much on their own language as possible so that they can have a better trust in our system. But translating an app is not a big issue, while actually giving the support is. So who better can actually support a language than the one who natively speaking it?
You mentioned trust, which is clearly fundamental to what Taqanu is looking to do. Tell us more about the trust point, because I think not only is it a hugely important one here, but it may also be different, kind of seen through the eyes of a refugee as opposed to your standard developed world middle-class citizen.
Yes, so trust in banking is definitely a problematic point for every participant in the scene, as since 2008, many customers just don't trust their bank anymore. But this is not the problem actually that newcomers or refugees have, because they just lost trust in humanity because they were left behind. So gaining their trust is incredibly hard. And this is why we also not try to go down to camps and convince them that I'm the white guy who will give you an identity and a financial access, but to work together with organizations on the ground who already built some form of trust with the people in their realm, and convince them and work together with them to actually help refugees to access these banking system. And as well, previously I mentioned the big corporates, even though they might have a greedy edge to them, they definitely bring a level of trust in everyone, also governments and regulations, but also people. People recognize these brands, and we as a partner or as a supportee actually can leverage that trust to actually work together with clients.
You mentioned there are a number of ways that you can support NGOs, supranational organizations with things like food delivery, medical supplies to these groups. Have you engaged NGOs and supranationals in dialogue? And if so, what is the feedback been?
So yes, we have several meetings with these organizations, and generally they are very interested. Some of them already looked into identification system, like digital identification system. For some of them, it was a notion that really opened up their eyes. And generally speaking, they were very interested. As this, we are basically creating identity that can have a digital wallet that can manage any form of digital tokens or vouchers, which can be used for food delivery or any of the previously mentioned assets.
You mentioned that Taqanu will be delivered via mobile phones. Do all refugees have access to mobile phones? Is that a viable way to get to everyone?
So yes, there is a lot of research around it, and we have been proved again and again visiting different camps that most refugees have a smartphone. This is basically the only way they keep track of the world. They keep contact with their loved ones. They use the map to cross borders. They use WhatsApp to talk to each other, to learn about news, and they are also on Facebook to learn about anything that happens in the world, plus to kill time. So definitely mobile first, and we have no question around that would they have a phone or not.
What's the 20-year vision for Taqanu? What's Taqanu going to look like 20 years from now?
So in 20 years, I think Taqanu will be an underlying identification technology globally, or one of the underlying identification technology globally for those who have lack of access or poor access to government-supported services. And with that, there will be many, many services using Taqanu's identification platform to provide a positive impact on the life of those who are using it.
Look, I absolutely love what you guys are doing. This is hugely important work. I wholly applaud you, and very much look forward to seeing what you guys do.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to have a lot of support. And I can tell that during the whole journey of creating Taqanu, we have been receiving unbiased support from people because they just see the level of impact and the difference of thinking how banking could actually work.
Speaking of support, what support can our audience give you? Would you have any asks for our audience?
We are working together with the German financial regulations, which are a very developed conversation. But as we move forward, we would like to engage with different regulators. So if there is anyone who can help us to open doors to more fintech-oriented regulators like the FCA in London or FINMA in Switzerland or the BAS in Singapore, I'm very happy to follow up and work together to see their openness on the idea. And of course, to link us and connect us with different NGOs who are working with disenfranchised group and who we could help to actually identify their supportees.
What's the best way for people to find out more about Taqanu and connect with you directly?
We have an online presence. Our website is kept very minimal, so we are not telling too much on our website. But if someone Googles Taqanu, there will be a lot of information. Our main channel is Facebook. So if someone wants to reach out, just write a Facebook message or at Twitter at Taqanu.
Balazs Nemethi, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And look, let me once again applaud the work you're doing. It's really, really phenomenal.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.